Today in the lab, I'm going to be sharing how I made these little hummingbird shelf sitters out of plastic water bottles. So you need 2 water bottles for each hummingbird, and you can use the clear bottles. The thinner the plastic, the better and the easier it will be to work with. If you have colored bottles, you can try those as well. Or today I'm going to be using some bottles that I colored with some alcohol inks. And if you're interested in some other ways to color or how to color the bottles with alcohol ink, I will link to a video in the description on all the different ways that I tested for coloring the bottles. You're also going to need a large bead roller or quilling tool. I made this one with a cotter pin, and I have a tutorial on how to make a smaller version if you're interested in that I will also link to. But they're inexpensive. You can find them on Amazon. You're going to need some cutting tools. This is sort of a heavy-duty cutting tool. They're called nail pulling pliers, and I really like them for cutting harder metals. You need a couple of cutting tools to cut the plastic bottles with. I have an X-Acto knife here to get started and my scissors to cut the rest of the plastic. You want some clear packing tape. You're also going to need some 20 gauge wire. I'm using the silver 20 gauge wire. A couple of jewelry pliers. I just have some cutting pliers here and some round tipped jewelry pliers. You want a ruler. And then you also need 2 little pins that have a black round head on them for each of the birds. You're also going to need a sealer. I'm going to use this DuraClear gloss varnish for my project. You want some E6000 glue and also some UV resin. And last, you need an iron. I recommend having sort of a dedicated crafting iron. You don't necessarily want to be ironing your nice clothing with this after you use it for this project. And you need a little bit of double-sided tape, a small tea candle, some matches, and a small paintbrush. So I'm starting with my 2 colored bottles here, and if you decide to color your bottles, you want to make sure that whatever you use is completely dry before you go ahead and make your hummingbirds. And I like to color my 2 bottles in different but sort of complementary colors. You can certainly do them all the same color if you prefer. So the first thing I want to do is just cut the tops of my bottles off along this top ridge here. So I just like to use the X-Acto knife to do that. You can use scissors or whatever's easiest. You do want to try to cut as straight as possible, so I'm just kind of staying in this little ridge here. So we're going to be using this portion of the bottle to make the beads, but you do want to save your top piece. Now on my particular bottles, these labels are the perfect size for me to start cutting my beads. So if you need to, you can cut a strip that is 1 3/8 of an inch wide and tape it onto your bottles. But I'm just going to use my label because they come off on these bottles, they come off very easily and they're already the right size. So I'm going to take my double-sided tape and just add a few pieces to one of my labels so that I can stick it back onto the bottle. And the first cuts that we make are going to be for the bigger bead or the body portion of the hummingbird, and I want to start that in my red color. So I'm going to start with my red bottle, and I just want to put my label back on here and line it up as closely as I can to this top edge of the bottle where I've cut. And then I'm just going to kind of slit my bottle down the center here. And then I can go ahead and just cut along the edge of my label here. Don't worry if your cuts aren't perfectly smooth. This is sort of a difficult material to cut because it's so wobbly, but so this is my first piece, and you want to keep these in order. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my label off. I want to make sure I get my tape back off though. So I'm just going to set that off to the side, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to put my label starting at my slit, and I want to just line it up with the top again. And don't worry if it's not fitting exactly, because the bottle has sort of a taper to it. You just want to get that paper lined up with your top edge. And then I'm going to go back, and instead of cutting right along the label's edge, I'm going to cut about 1/8 of an inch off of the label, so that this next piece will be just a little bit narrower. So now I've got my second piece, and again I'm just going to pull this label off. Set my second piece aside and just repeat that process. I want 7 strips, so I'm going to cut this label down 1/8 of an inch at a time until I have 7 strips. And this bottle will not be enough for that, so I am going to have to use a couple of yellow strips, but I'm going to use those for my narrower pieces that go on kind of the top of my bead to add a little bit of color there. So here's my third strip. I'm going to trim my label down again about 1/8 of an inch. So there's my third strip. And it's helpful if you keep your straight edge, keep one straight edge of the label to line up with your top edge of plastic. So you should be able to get your first 5 pieces out of your first bottle. So I'm going to get one more piece here. So now I'm going to switch to my yellow bottle, but I'm keeping my original strip that I've been working with. Go ahead and slit this down here. So I'm going to just line up my strip with the top edge here. So here are the 7 strips that I'm going to be using for the body portion of the hummingbird. And now I'm going to cut the bead for the head. So I'm going to take my second label, and again I'm just going to add some double-sided tape. And again I'm just going to line up my label. If you're drawing your own strips, you want to draw a strip that's 11/16 inch, that's hard to say, 11/16 inch wide. For me, I'm just going to cut my label in half here. And then I can discard this portion of it. And this is my first piece for the head. And I'm going to proceed cutting down my label 1/8 of an inch, just like I did for the other pieces. And I'm going to do that 3 more times so that I have 4 strips of plastic for the head. So when you're finished cutting your bottles, you should have 7 strips to make the body, and it's okay if there are a couple of the strips that are a different color. And then you should have 4 strips for the head. The next thing I want to do is I want to put some tape on my pieces of plastic. So I'm just going to use my packing tape, and I'm going to tear off a fairly long piece. And then I just like to kind of hook it to my tape gun so that I can keep track of it. And I'm just going to cut pieces of tape that are kind of the width of my pieces of plastic. So I don't need to put a piece of tape on my first roll, but I want a piece of tape that's roughly as wide as my second strip of plastic. If anything, you want to cut it a little narrower rather than wider. And then I'm just going to put it about halfway onto my piece of plastic and leave the other half off. Now, as long as you don't want to connect your tape to your other piece of plastic. So for this one, for example, I'm going to cut my tape. Put it onto the plastic, and then I'm going to tuck the tape inside so that it doesn't get stuck to this piece of plastic. And I'll just carry on until I have tape on all of my pieces. Going to set aside my yellow pieces here and just work on this first bead that will make up the body of the hummingbird. And then I want to take a piece of tape that's a wider, that's maybe about 2 inches long and just the width of my narrowest strip. And I'm just going to cut that piece and kind of set it somewhere where I can grab it easily. So now I'm ready to roll my bead, and I'm going to take the biggest piece and slide it between the 2 barrels of my bead roller here and just start rolling. So I'm just going to roll this first section. I want to keep it pretty tight. And I'm going to try to keep this top edge kind of even, and I'm not going to worry about what happens at the back end here. It'll be a little more tapered. So when I'm ready, when I get to the end here, I'm going to grab my second section, and normally when you're rolling beads you probably would line them up and you'd have more of a taper, but because I want one of my ends of my bead to be a little flatter and the other one to be more pointed, I'm going to line my pieces up this way so that the top edge is even and the lower edge has the bigger gap. And it isn't going to be perfect, but I am going to try to roll this top piece with the edge a little flatter so that I have sort of a flatter end and a more pointed end once I'm finished. And then when I get to the end here, I'm going to grab my next piece, line up my pieces so that that top edge is even. Oops. You could tape all these pieces together before you started rolling, but I just think it's kind of too unruly to have that long of a piece because there's already a curve in the plastic. But if you want to do it that way, you could. So I'm just going to continue rolling and adding my pieces as I go, making sure I'm keeping them all in the right order. So you can see a little bit better what I'm talking about. This edge is flatter and this one has more of the taper to it. Alright, so I'm going to add my last piece here. And this gets a little tricky to hold, and don't worry if it's not perfect. It looks a little bit like a hot mess right now, but we'll fix that in a minute. You just want to make sure that you're keeping everything pretty tight. So once you get to the end of your last piece, you're going to want to grab your small, longer piece and use it to secure the bead tightly closed. And if you need to, you can add another piece of tape. So that's what it should look like. And it can be a little tricky to get off of the bead roller. You may have to kind of reshape it once you do, but just kind of gently twist and pull until you remove it from the bead roller. And now I'm going to do the same process to roll the smaller bead. I'm going to add some pieces of tape, cut a nice long piece of tape to secure it at the end, and then roll it in a similar way so that I have a flatter end and a more pointed end. So here are the two shapes once you're done rolling, and you can see that they're pretty rough and, you know, unfinished looking, I guess. So I'm heating up my iron on the hottest heat setting, and I'm going to go ahead and just try to kind of reshape these a little bit on the iron. You probably want to do this in a well ventilated area because you are going to be melting the plastic a little bit. Now we're not going to melt it a ton, but we are going to just smooth out some of these loose pieces and just make the shape a lot nicer and more uniform. So I'm just grabbing this with my round-tipped jewelry pliers, and I'm going to gently kind of roll it around on my iron to try to melt down a little bit of those pieces that are the most unruly. And you'll see already that I'm getting a much smoother shape. So that's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the other side and try to kind of clean up and smooth out some of those edges as well. So hopefully you can see the difference here, how you get a much cleaner, kind of more finished look. And it doesn't take very long. So that's what your shapes should look like when you're finished. I'm not sure how well you can see this on camera, but this is a bead that I've rolled and I haven't done the little bit of melting on the iron yet. So hopefully you can see that it's a little more open and the pieces aren't quite as smooth, and the ironing just kind of smooths that out a little bit. So it doesn't make it a perfectly rounded shape, but it does kind of smooth out the pieces that are sticking out. Like you can see here, hopefully, that this is very loose. And once you heat that up a little bit, it kind of curls it up and tightens it up a little bit just to make the bead have a little bit more finished look. So I'm ready to start the assembly, and I'm going to attach the eyes first. So I'm using 2 of my little straight pins with the black ball tip or ends on them, and I'm just going to slide them between the layers of my plastic here. So I like to put them kind of, there's usually a little bit of a point here, and I'm going to want my eyes to be sort of even with that. So I'm going to just stick them through the layers here. You want to be careful not to poke your fingers. If you don't have pins, you probably could glue a small black bead on. I don't know if it would be quite as secure, but it would probably work. You want to be careful not to uncoil your bead either, because it will still shift around a little bit, even though you've taped it and even though you have sort of melted a few of the edges. You don't really have it. It's not a solid plastic piece, so you should be able to slide the pins through fairly easily. And then I'm just going to use my nail pulling pliers. You can use any kind of heavy duty wire cutters that you have to cut the ends off. And next I'm going to take my 20 gauge wire and I'm going to cut my pieces of wire. So I need one piece that is 14 inches long. One piece that is 8 inches long. And 2 pieces that are 5 inches long. So I'm going to start with my 14-inch wire, and I'm just going to fold it in half. And I'll use my pliers to make a nice sharp fold or bend here. And then I'm going to thread my beads onto the wire. And this portion will become in hummingbirds, I don't know what they are. They're not beaks. What are they? They're little, whatever they suck the pollen out of flowers with. And I like to make mine, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to have the beads kind of on it in the right length of beak. I guess I'm going to call it their beak. I'm not sure what to call it. And then I just want to bend my other 2 wires out so I know where the beads should go on my wire. And then I'm going to go ahead and take them back off. And I'm going to switch to my 5-inch wires, and I'm going to take one at a time and just wrap them around my larger bead. And I want to get the wire tight around the widest portion of the bead, and I want it my ends to be centered so they're about the same length. So I'm just going to hold the wire as tight as I can and then twist it once. Kind of make sure it's in the right spot on the bead. And then I'm going to twist a couple more times to tighten it and to make a little length of twisted wire. So it should be on there fairly securely. And I'm just going to repeat that process with my second wire. You do kind of have to fold your ends out of the way because you want this is going to form the little leg for the bird, and you want your legs to be positioned sort of next to each other. But for this first twist, you can kind of not worry exactly where that is. So I'm just going to make sure I get everything even, twist it once, and then slide it over into position where I want the other leg to be. And then I'll twist a couple, 3 times to tighten up the wire and to make my little length of twisted leg, I guess. If you need to, you can use your pliers to kind of tighten up the wires, but hopefully, ideally, you can kind of keep your wires together as they go around, and then you'll have maybe 1/4 of an inch between the two little leg portions. So now I'm ready to thread my beads back onto my 14-inch wire. And I'm going to take my last piece of wire and fold it in half as well. And I want to pinch it with my pliers too to make a nice tight bend in the wire. And I'm going to get my E6000 glue. I have a little bit left in this tube here. You probably could use the UV resin glue for all of this if you wanted to. I just kind of prefer to work with the E6000 glue when I can, and I like it because it's a little flexible and the UV resin is kind of a more brittle hold. So first off, I'm going to start by making sure that my beads are slid all the way to the back where I've bent them. I'm going to add a little bit of glue right at the base here. Slide my bead back, and I'm going to insert my last piece of wire, just maybe a 1/2 inch or so. And then this next bit of glue is kind of optional, but I like to put a little bit of glue on the bottom here where the legs are, just to secure the wires a little bit more. And I'm going to put just a tiny bit behind the eyes to hold them on as well. And to do that, I like to use a toothpick just because I only want a tiny bit of glue. So I'm just going to kind of put a little bit around each leg, just in case the wires slip, that they won't slide right off. And the last bit of glue I'm going to apply is to secure the two beads together. So I want to make sure I've got this pushed all the way back to my fold here, just double checking. And then if you have sort of a top and bottom to your bird's head, this is pretty uniform. You just want to make sure you have it positioned correctly with the legs. And I like to use quite a bit of glue on this step because I want to kind of fill in this space so that it's not quite so distinct that there's two separate beads here. But if you're doing that, you have to kind of be careful that you're not letting the glue drip. So I'm just going to add quite a bit of glue, hopefully sort of fill in that gap. And if you need to move the glue around, you can adjust it a little with your toothpick. And then I want to be sure that I have the head positioned correctly with where my legs are. So right now his eyes are kind of sideways. So you just want to make sure that you're getting everything positioned the way you want it before you let the glue actually cure. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to go back to my two little cap pieces, and we're going to use these pieces for the wing. Now you probably only need one of these, but I like to seal both of them just in case I mess up and I need the other one. So most likely I'm going to use the red for the wings, but I'm going to go ahead and seal the yellow piece as well. So I'm going to be using this Duraclear gloss varnish, and I'm just going to sort of drip a little bit in there, spread it around with my brush, and let it dry. As you do this, you will kind of move around the ink a little bit, but I think it just spreads it out and kind of sometimes even improves the way that it looks. So don't worry if you're getting a little bit of ink moving around. And this sealer will dry easily in the amount of time that it takes your E6000 glue to set up. So that's all you need to do with those pieces, and then you can just set them aside to dry as well. So once your E6000 glue has cured for 24 hours, you can go ahead and finish shaping your wires. And what I like to do is pull my shorter wires on the tail feathers here to the outside, and I'm going to pull the longer wires toward the middle. And then for the feet here, I'm going to trim my wires down to about 5/8 of an inch maybe. So you do want these to be pretty close to the same length. And then I'm going to take my round-tipped jewelry pliers and just coil the wires back using the lower end of my barrel to make the coil pretty big. And I'm just going to curl it back, not all the way, but just to make sort of a little hook. And then I'll do that with the other 4 wires. And then once I have the feet shaped, I want to go ahead and sort of tip them forward just a little bit. So I'm going to grab the wire right at the end of the twisted portion and just tip the wire forward. And next I'm going to shape the tail feather wires. And to do that, I just like to start with the smaller tip of my jewelry pliers and make a fairly small coil. And then I'm just going to grab the wire and loosely coil it to make a nice open coil like that. And I'll do that on the other 3 wires. And once you're done making all your coils in the wires, you can shape the tail feathers any way you want to. I kind of like to turn my coils upward. And then sort of tighten them together a little bit. And now we're ready to move on to the wings. So I'm going to grab one of my caps that I have sealed. And for this step, you also need a little paper wing template. I just sketched this really simple shape. It's about 2.5 inches long and 5/8 of an inch at the back here where this end will attach to the body. And then you can just draw a curve any way you want to. If you want to draw your shape slightly differently, you could certainly do that. But this is just a very simple shape based off of a square corner that is 5/8 by 2.5 inches. So I've got some double-sided tape on here, and you want to just lay this on here as flat as you can because of the curve of the bottle, it's not going to be perfect. You can't really put it right on the top edge. It won't lay flat or smoothly. So you just kind of want to let it lay as clean and flat as you can across this curve. And you're going to need 2 pieces like this. So I'm just going to attach my second piece in a similar fashion. And then I'll just carefully cut out the shape using my scissors. So once you have your shapes cut, you can remove the paper template. And then I'm just going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut slits all along the curved edge. And you can cut them, I don't know, mine are usually about 1/4 of an inch deep. You can cut them a little bit deeper than that if you want to. And you want them fairly close together so they're sort of tiny little slits in the plastic. Maybe a 1/16 of an inch wide. They don't have to all be perfectly the same width or the same length, but you just want to kind of slit all the way along the curved edge here. And then I like to kind of fold them sort of back and forth so that I can kind of separate them and so they're not all kind of going the same direction or laying quite as flat. So I just push some to the either side to kind of give it a little more dimension. And then I will repeat that on the other piece. For this next step, we're going to be using the candle and the matches, and you again want to probably do this in a well-ventilated area because we are going to melt the plastic. And this will happen really quickly, so you want to be very cautious and move kind of quickly in order to just melt the edges of your plastic all the way around, just a little bit. So it doesn't take much. You can see that those are already starting to curl up here. And that's all you're looking for, is just a little bit of definition between the pieces. So you can see that it's very fast. And you can definitely overdo it pretty easily if you leave the piece too long. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and just do a similar application just along the other edge just to smooth it out a little bit so I don't have such straight pointed edges. And if it curls up like this, that's fine. You can still work with the plastic and kind of reshape it a little bit if you need to. So that's what we're looking for, is just some little definition to the cut portions and a little bit more of a rippled edge along the other two edges. Once you have your wings shaped, you want to go ahead and kind of decide how you want them on the bird, so you can have them kind of more up or a little bit more down. So I'm going to switch to my UV resin now because you need something that will bond really quickly. So you want your gloves when you're working with this glue. And if you've never used it, it's kind of a fun glue to work with because it does grab so quickly and you don't need a lot of surface contact. The kit I have was fairly inexpensive, and it comes with the resin and also with the UV light. And I apologize if I'm calling this glue. Some people get upset about the glue comment, but I'm using it as glue, so I think of it as glue. So I'm just going to put a little bit of the resin on one of my wings here, the bottom side. And then I'm going to carefully set it in place, but I want to make sure that I have my UV light ready to go here. So I'm going to get it placed where I want it. And then in just about 5 or 10 seconds, this resin will cure and my wing will be attached. So I'm just going to repeat that process with my other wing here. And that will complete the hummingbird. So that does it for today's video. If you'd like to learn how to make beads from plastic bottles, click the link below. Also, if you'd like to receive the Upcycled Design Lab newsletter, there's a place to sign up in the description box. If you haven't already, I'd love for you to click that subscribe button to join my YouTube community. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.